us today for the launch of the Ekos BioCredita program. Ko Josh Lainauers, tōku ingoa. My name is Josh Lainauers. I'm a carbon analyst here at Ekos, and I'll be guiding you through today's seminar. We're thrilled to have two incredible speakers with us. We've got our very own Sean Weaver, who is our CEO at Ekos, and we have Helen Hughes, Tai Urungi, Chief Executive of Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari. BioCredita is a biodiversity credit program developed by Ekos to help fund biodiversity conservation in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But just before we get started with the actual webinar, just a couple of administrative points to raise. The webinar is being recorded. It'll be made available later to all those who have registered, and it will also be made available on the Ekos website. We'll start hearing from Sean and Helen first, and we'll move on to them answering questions from you, the webinar participants. So feel free to start posting questions in the Q&A chat. Note that you may upvote questions if existing questions align with your query, and then we'll prioritize these ones. So we'll kick off with Sean to introduce BioCredita, and then we'll move into a conversation with Helen to learn how BioCredita is supporting Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari. So, Sean, let's start from the top. What exactly are biodiversity credits and how would they work?
Thanks, Josh, and kia ora koutou. So biodiversity credits are essentially a way to fund biodiversity conservation. Each biodiversity credit in our system, at least, represents a quantum of measured, reported and verified biodiversity conservation output. This might be invasive control or habitat restoration or single species protection, any number of possible things, because of course biodiversity conservation involves many different types of management. The Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari Biodiversity Credits Project is the first project in the Ekos BioCredita program, and the biodiversity credits issued to the Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari project, they represent invasive species control, habitat restoration, fence monitoring, invasives monitoring, fence repair, and that for an area of 3,363 hectares of indigenous forest habitat, including wetlands and things like that. And each credit from Sanctuary Mountain, as an example, is those conservation management outputs and then divided into smaller pieces rather than the whole budget for the whole mountain. You could then possibly divide it into hectares, so 3,363 units if they were hectare based units. We've divided the units into even smaller pieces, so they're each 1/100th of a hectare. And each biodiversity credit represents that conservation management delivered in that area for 1 year and priced at cost. So I've mentioned Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari and what a wonderful project that is, and it's fantastic having you here, Helen, to help us launch this with the use case and the example with this demonstration project. So Helen, could you tell us about Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari, what it is, and what have been some of your key conservation achievements over the years?
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for allowing us to be here today and to be part of this launch with you guys. So for those of you who don't know much about Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari, we're located in the heart of the Waikato behind Karapiro, not too far from Cambridge. If you've been to Arapuni Dam, we're just the big maunga that you can see behind you there. We were established as an organisation in the early 2000s, essentially a community effort to deliver 47 kilometres of predator fencing. And as Sean has mentioned, that goes over 3,363 hectares. So just for a sense of scale, we are as big as Uluru in Australia, or 10 times the size of Central Park in New York, so fairly significant in size. And what that size has allowed us to do is to grow a population of species. We have 730 native species on the Maunga, and that includes a very strong resident population of kiwi. So in around 2005, we translocated kiwi from Tongariro, and since that time we have translocated more kiwi in and grown kiwi. So we now have a resident population of around 3,000 kiwi. And that's allowed us to do the next step. We run the largest translocation program of kiwi in the country. That means we're taking our biodiversity that we achieve on the Maunga, and we're transporting that out to the likes of the Capital Kiwi Project, to Tongariro, to Taranaki. And we do that every year alongside our partners, Save the Kiwi. We also work with the kakapo. We're the only mainland site in the country that have kakapo. We have currently a resident population of 3 and are working alongside the kakapo recovery team and DOC to really deliver some amazing outcomes and lots of learnings as we go through the trial. One of the things with us is I always say, yes, we absolutely do conservation, but alongside conservation, we also do a heck ton of other things. So whilst we're delivering these amazing outcomes, we're also working on some of the SDGs, including good health and wellbeing, education, climate action, and perhaps one of the things that we do most importantly is productive partnerships. So we are a fully functioning co-governance model. We have 3 iwi that we work with within the Maunga. Our prevailing iwi is Ngāti Koriki Kahukura. And a lot of what we do is to work alongside and make sure that we're delivering on the aspirations that they want. We've got 200 volunteers, and we've got a community outreach program that we run where we connect with some of the most vulnerable people in the community. So as we deliver conservation, we are hand in hand also delivering on some of the social outcomes. So Sean, perhaps you can talk to me and talk to the team here today around environmental integrity behind the program that you've created of BioCredita, and maybe explain to them a little bit about the verification process that we've had to go through in order to be here today.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, it's fantastic to be partnering with such a wonderful organisation doing amazing things. And it's really an example of what can happen when biodiversity is really supported. Now, the biodiversity credits in our BioCredita program are real, measured, additional, independently verified and priced at cost. Verification needs to happen with an independent auditor. And the auditor that we have in this process is Hughes and Shaw Limited. They're a wonderful environmental auditing firm based in Christchurch that Ekos has been working with for many years. And it's fantastic having them involved as an independent third-party auditor for the Sanctuary Mountain Biodiversity Credits Project. The verification that they do is against a standard. And so we've developed the Ekos SD standard. SD stands for Sustainable Development, of which biodiversity conservation is one among the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So BioCredita is the biodiversity scope of the Ekos SD program. Now the Ekos SD standard has been developed over a number of years, also in conjunction with the work that Ekos has been involved with in the International Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is an international body that is setting the integrity foundations for biodiversity markets globally. And so the Ekos standard against which Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari project has been verified against has been internationally peer reviewed. The credits that are issued on a blockchain registry that we developed over the last 2 to 3 years in partnership with a wonderful Danish tech firm called Trusticate. You'll see their logo there just above the McHugh and Shaw logo on, I guess, certainly on Helen's left and on the right hand of my screen, certainly. Anyway, the registry is built on blockchain technology, which is Web3 technology, which is distributed ledger, and it means that it can't be tampered with. And once you've got documentation in there, it's locked essentially. The digital registry is designed to enable everything that happens to be transparent, every biodiversity credit issued to be publicly traceable. It retires units on end use so they cannot be double sold. It also enables a secondary market to operate because entities could gain a registry account as a market intermediary to receive biodiversity credits and then on sell them. Or an end user would be an organization or a person who's buying those biodiversity credits for an end use, such as some kind of environmental claim. So that's essentially the verification piece and the kind of tech infrastructure that sits behind this program. Now, the Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari is this, in a way, a test drive of proving the market and proving the systems and the infrastructure. So, and in talking about the mountain, Helen, could you share what your experience has been with, say, using grant funding to support the conservation management on the mountain, and also why you've reached out to Ekos to explore a biodiversity credits option, which is essentially a market-based mechanism? Over to you, Helen.
Sure. Yeah, so look, for those of you that haven't worked in the not-for-profit space before, and to be clear, this is the first time I've worked in a not-for-profit space. It's a really fascinating place to walk into. Unlike other businesses where you would look to build better widgets, better products, you might look for operational efficiencies to drive down cost. When you work in a not-for-profit space, you are very much at the, I suppose, mercy in some respects of what funding is available out there. It's very hard to derive revenue in our world. So I call it the Oliver operating model. It means that, we're constantly, please, sir, can I have some more? And what we've seen, particularly post-COVID, is that there are increasingly limited funding opportunities. We're seeing situations where philanthropic funders historically might have 1, 2, 3 times the amount of funding requests than they have money. Some of those funders have given me feedback at the moment that there are 7, 8, and 9 times the amount of funding requests than there is money for. And in fact, if I look at the last Department of Conservation community funding round, that was oversubscribed. There was around $7 million, maybe $9 million worth of funding, and over $100 million worth of funding requests that come through. So it's a really challenging environment to operate. We have fixed overheads here in terms of the fence and the fence replacement. It costs us on average $5,000 a day to keep the sanctuary running. And so as the CE here, 90% of my role at the moment is running around trying to find funding for us in this really challenging place. So we need to diversify, and we've got to be smarter. And I've set the organisation on a journey where we have truly diversified revenue streams. So we've been out looking for ways that we can do things better, smarter, brighter. And essentially the goal for us is to achieve what we call our fiscal kete. It's a traditional woven bag, and I look at biodiversity credits as being one of those strands that kind of carries us forward as an organisation. So we've been talking with people and testing the market, and I had a really great conversation last week. And if Ashley, you're on the call today, thank you for your time last week. And one of the questions I had from Ashley, who works in the private sector, is around, is this just offsetting? Is this just another way of offsetting carbon? And it's not. It's very different. And I thought maybe, Sean, you might be better to answer rather this question. So, how do biodiversity credits differ from carbon? Can they be used for offsetting carbon emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And your description of how hard it is to gain grant funding and essentially the funding gap for biodiversity conservation, you've laid it out really clearly there. And that speaks to the purpose of why we developed the BioCredita program, because the whole point is to try and unlock money from the private sector, because the philanthropic sector and the government grant funding sector just can't keep up with the demand and for the need. And this is a global trend. It's not just restricted to New Zealand. Internationally, the biodiversity funding gap is massive, and organisations that are looking into it and saying, well, how can we solve this problem, increasingly are saying that we need to also look at private sector financing as part of the puzzle. And that's essentially what this is about. So if you're going to sell something, well, if you want to get money from the private sector, you often have to sell them something, because if you can, and if that's valuable to private sector entities, then you can start to scale that up. And we're at a time in the development of global economies where there's an increasing need for organizations to demonstrate that they're a responsible corporate citizen. carbon markets are, and voluntary carbon markets are part of that puzzle. So, voluntary carbon offsetting would be where an organisation measures their carbon footprint voluntarily, and discovers how much carbon pollution they produce, and then use that measurement to develop a reduction plan and implement that reduction strategy. But even with lots and lots of effort and cost and investment in emission reductions, organisations and families, schools, anybody tends to discover that they can't get their emissions down to zero. And so if they want to take responsibility for the residual emissions and essentially voluntarily take responsibility for those emissions, then one way to do that is to buy carbon credits as a carbon offset. Now, carbon credits contain a quantum of measured, reported and verified carbon benefit to the atmosphere. And each carbon credit is a tonne of CO2, either that's been sequestered into a permanent forest or has been prevented from getting into the atmosphere in the first place. Biodiversity credits, on the other hand, they represent a quantum of measured, reported and verified biodiversity conservation output, and that's not always the same as carbon. You can imagine a project that, or say for example Sanctuary Mountain, it's a tall old growth forest. It contains a lot of carbon, but it's not growing annually in its carbon stocks because it's old growth. It's a wee bit like an old growth human like me. I'm not growing anymore. Whereas I was growing when I was younger, and your forest isn't growing anymore. It's just the emissions are being replaced by the sequestration, and it's essentially a steady state. So your project can't be a carbon project. However, the biodiversity benefits of your project are immense. And so what biodiversity credits do, and certainly our BioCredita program, it measures, reports and verifies those biodiversity conservation outputs, and it turns them into units that people can buy. So they're entirely focused on biodiversity. And for that reason, well, they're not carbon credits, they're biodiversity credits. So, used for things like environment, social and governance reporting, or nature-based financial disclosure reporting, or being embedded into value chains. Like imagine, for example, one day we could buy biodiversity enriched electricity from an electricity retailer, or biodiversity enriched windows from a window manufacturer. Or actually we can already do that because the first buyer from Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari is a window manufacturer. Imagine biodiversity enriched houses, imagine biodiversity enriched anything. So biodiversity credits enable private sector entities to embed biodiversity conservation into those value chains. And to me, that's the exciting part of the puzzle, because it's not requiring people to go down the carbon path. They can get directly into looking after biodiversity. So I'd like to ask you another question, Helen. So how have you experienced biodiversity credit funding to be different from traditional grant funding approaches?
I think you've touched a little bit on there, Sean. Perhaps the easiest way to explain it in my world is that grant funding and sponsorship is future focused. Essentially, what we see is that funders will try and mitigate risk, and this ultimately is a big risk conversation. It's about saying, how do we mitigate risk and still provide funding and contribute towards really good outcomes? How current funding grants are done, the majority of them, is they mitigate risk through implementing fairly extensive contracts with milestones, and sometimes just delivery of those contracts alone can take months and months of work. Conversely, biodiversity credits represent a zero risk discussion from my perspective, in that the buyer is buying something that's already been done. This is work that we've had completed, it's fully audited, it's been fully verified, and we know that we're selling something that has already been completed. Now, if that sounds a little bit weird for people, kind of turn your head to a bottle of wine and think about, producers of wine. they'll grow the grapes, they'll produce the wine, they'll send the wine out to market, and then consumers come along and purchase that bottle of wine. Essentially, each bottle of wine represents the overheads and the costs that they've had in order to create that bottle of wine. We're doing exactly the same thing, and we're applying it into our environmental space. So what we're releasing today is our 2024 vintage, and it is called a 2024 vintage, which appeals. And for me, that means that next year we'll release a 25 vintage and then a 26 vintage, and we'll continue every year. The amount of units that we have available may differ and the price per unit may differ, but it's just showing a real difference in mindset. It's shifting the lens to say, actually, what we're looking to do is to have people consume our product and recover the costs that we've already done in the process of creating that product. For the buyers of our credits, I think that adds a real confidence when you're purchasing, is that it is audited and completed, and that you're delivering, you're buying something that's delivering from an ESG perspective, both in the environmental and the social outcomes, and with a really strong co-governance framework behind it, which is, I think it contributes to your corporate goals and the social license to operate. So I look at this and go, this is way better in many respects than traditional grant funding and sponsorship. It's zero risk. And I think that's the biggest difference that I could offer up today. So Sean, with that in mind, who would you say would buy biodiversity credits? Who's the consumer, and where do they get them from? What do they cost?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And when you were describing that difference between grant funding and biodiversity credits funding, it's we're a bit like the grant funding operates in essentially a futures market where somebody says to a funder, please give me money now so I can cause good in the future, and I promise to cause 100 goods. And the grant funder says, okay, fair enough, here's the money, go away and use it and cause those 100 goods, and then come back and report to us later, next year or the year after or the year after. If you were to do that in the wine industry or the food industry, farmers would ask people to pay for their produce now and then use that money to go and produce them and then deliver the results long into the future. And of course, that's quite risky. And of course, farming doesn't operate that way. The farmer has to produce the good in order to sell, and then sell it for a price that will recover the cost of producing it. And what this does, as you mentioned, is it takes the non-delivery risk out of the equation for the person who's doing the funding. Because like a bottle of wine or a sack of organic potatoes, you can pick it up, you buy it, you own it, and there's no risk of non-delivery. And our goal here is to enable private sector entities who want to cause good in the biodiversity space to add another 2 or 3 zeros to the amount of money that they're willing to spend because of this confidence of delivery and this transparency. Because, of course, in order to produce the biodiversity credits, you have to do all of your measurement, reporting and verification, and all of that reporting is sitting there on the registry. It's publicly available to anyone to see. And so it's a really disciplined form of fundraising, essentially. But for the buyer, it means that it lowers the transaction cost of spending money on nature, and it's able to spend that money very, very directly. So who would want to spend money on nature? Well, increasingly, many businesses are finding that their access to markets and access to investment capital and their social license to operate is increasingly dependent on demonstrating that they're a responsible corporate citizen. And one way to do that is through things like environment, social and governance reporting, or nature-based financial disclosure reporting. And biodiversity credits represent one way for such organisations to meet those reporting requirements, but again, at a relatively low transaction cost, because the sustainability desk of a corporate doesn't need to go out and build a project or build a whole lot of relationships with project developers. They can just come essentially to a delicatessen and buy the biodiversity credits from the project that they like the look of. And eventually, Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari is the first project. We hope that in the future there'll be other projects, and I'm sure there will be, but it makes that a lot easier for the buyer, and all the information is ready and there. in front of them, and it's all traceable, and they can find all of the, if they want to do due diligence and drill down into the project and dive into the deep reporting, then all of that reporting and the verification reports associated with it are sitting there on the registry for anybody to see. So you mentioned the unit price might be different through time, and that's a good point, because the unit price isn't going to be the same between one project and another. And also it might change through time with a given project. So imagine a project that was going to do, let's say, an eradication of an invasive pest on an island. The effort to eradicate that pest is going to be concentrated in those first few years. And once you've got rid of the last of that pest species or that pest population, well, then the effort's going to necessarily go down. And so the cost for that conservation project will go down. So the way that we've structured the Ekos SD standard and the BioCredita program is that projects can adjust the cost of the unit, the pricing of the units through time based on the cost of conservation management. Also, a different project from yours might have a completely different cost structure to yours. And so its unit price reflects that cost structure, and anyone wanting to check that can, I guess, check the verification report where the verifier has scrutinized the conservation management budget to make sure that it's efficient and effective, and it's not hiding some sort of super profit or inefficiency in there, so that the buyer can be confident that that unit price is actually the true cost of delivering that conservation. So those who want to buy biodiversity credits from Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari can do that right now. Go to the Ekos website, and on our homepage there's a link on biodiversity credits, and go there and you can go to a buy now option. And as you mentioned, Helen, you know, the 2024 vintage is available now. They're priced at $12 each, and each one of them is 1/100th of a hectare of biodiversity conservation, measured, reported and verified, and priced at cost, and delivered for that 1 year. And the word vintage is used throughout the market-based mechanisms world for the carbon markets and biodiversity markets. So it's not just limited to wine. And of course, as you said, you'll release the 2025 vintage possibly later this year, because the 2025 financial year finishes in a couple of weeks. Some buyers are also interested in, can biodiversity credits sort of increase the value in the carbon market, and we also have carbon buyers who like the idea of buying a bundle of biodiversity credits and carbon credits in the same bundle. The carbon credits are for their carbon claim and their carbon reporting, and the biodiversity credits are flavouring it up. So at Ekos, we tend to only sell top shelf single malt carbon credits anyway. But what we can do, and what we do now, is provide bundles of carbon credits that don't have many or any biodiversity benefits in them, but are sold together with biodiversity credits from Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari project. So imagine, when I was a kid at school, I used to go to the shop and buy a bag of lollies, and there was different lollies in the bag. And if each bag has one of those milk bottle lollies and 3 jelly beans, and if the milk bottle is the carbon credit and the jelly beans are the biodiversity credits, and then the price for that little bag of lollies is whatever, well, in this case, it might be $30, $40, $50, $60 or whatever for the combination of things in the bag, then carbon buyers can also then support Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari. And we've already had buyers at Ekos purchase these bundles, and they're showing to be a reasonably popular way to monetize carbon credits. To monetize biodiversity credits to carbon buyers. But what I've just described there is an example of embedding biodiversity credits into a value chain. It just happens to be a carbon value chain. It could equally be a housing value chain, or a coffee value chain, or pencils, or anything that you like. So that's, I think, what the future might look like. So thinking about the future, what for you, Helen, does success look like, let's say in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It's a great question, and I mean, for those that work within a sector similar or the same as we do, obviously consistently fiscally strong would be the biggest delivery that we could achieve, because it means we're here forever. As an organisation, we have a 1,000-year vision for the sanctuary, and it's something that myself and the board sat down on a few months ago, and our co-chair Norma came up. She's from Ngāti Kora ki Kahukura, and she came up with the construct of making the monga sing, and it really seeps into every part of our organisation. So for me personally, 5 to 10 years, if I look out, it is that the monga is singing, not just that we have species thriving, but that the organisation is thriving in the same way, that we're internationally recognised, we're nationally cherished. I like to talk about the fact that we're seen in exactly the same light as Tongariro Crossing, as Milford Sound, a place of national significance where you have to come if you come to New Zealand. And then really for me, underpinning all of this is continuing to deliver to the aspirations of iwi and achieving the social outcomes that we do at scale. It really is a foundation or a cornerstone of our organisation. So making sure that we're still there and aligned is super important. So for us, these biodiversity credits are such a critical part of our direction over the next 5 to 10 years to get us to where we want to be, which is making the monga sing. For you, Sean, success look like for Ekos? What does it look like?
Well, we'd love to help make your dream come true. That's what success would look like for us. And that dream is to help conservation organisations become financially self-sustaining, because that's often the challenge, is how to get the revenue every year for a multi-decade or multi-century initiative. And grant funding typically won't do that. The grant funders would like to be there at the beginning, but they don't want to be on the hook forever. And this is where markets become important. And it also means that this is not in competition with grant funding. In fact, it's really a complementary measure to grant funding, where grant funders might get bigger beneficial bang for buck by helping to fund the setup of a biodiversity credits project, so that the market can then fund the operating costs into the future after the grant has been used to establish the project in the first place. So success for us looks like a fire hose of money from across the private sector being pointed at biodiversity conservation challenges in our country and elsewhere, where we change the course of history together and build a resilient biodiverse future.
Great. Hey, thank you so much, Helen and Sean. I think that conversation was really insightful in terms of giving us a really good foundation understanding of how BioCredita works, how it's supporting Sanctuary Mountain, which is fantastic, and the fact that there's a real need to keep the lights on as well for something as important to us as a nation as well. So, so what we're going to do is we'll open up for questions from the audience shortly. So if you haven't already, please pop your question in the Q&A chat or upvote ones that have already covered your query. At the moment, we'll probably start with them. At the moment, we've got over 50 questions, and we've got just under 200 people in the audience as well. So we're going to have to be democratic about it. Just letting you know that any questions that we don't answer, we'll attempt to kind of categorize them later on and answer them kind of post-webinar as well. And just note that obviously we've got limited time. We can't get to all your questions. And probably one thing to kind of mention here is that the session that we've got at the moment is kind of primarily focused on the market aspects of the SDUs, but we will explore how one might set up one's own biodiversity project and other topics at a later stage in future webinars. I see there's a question from Aotearoa, Port Hills, for instance, asking about their kind of potential projects. Yeah, so that will come in future as well. So, but just before we move on to the audience questions, so we have actually had a couple of questions come our way in the lead up to the webinar. So perhaps we'll start off with those ones to kind of honor them who've been really quick to respond. So what we've got here is a question here. We sometimes hear concern that biodiversity credits are putting a price on nature and are commodifying nature. This perhaps something to address, maybe. I'm not sure if you want to speak to that, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And it's a really important question. Unfortunately, nature has been commodified long ago by people who typically wreck it. And we're trying to, what we do in our program is put a price on the human labour and technology cost to look after nature, which is exactly what grant funders do. Because when you have a grant funding proposal, you say, well, I want to spend this money to do these things to look after those critters. And this is exactly the same. So we don't commodify nature. No nature is being traded. No nature is being exported or transferred. No biodiversity IP of Indigenous peoples or local communities. None of that is happening in our program. What is happening in our program is we are simply pricing what it costs to look after that particular place or those particular species. And of course, that does have a price because conservation costs money. That's essentially what it is. And, we'll continue to share a range of different ways that we do this. But also, and as you mentioned, all the questions that we've got, this is the first of a series of webinars. So if your question can't be answered today, then look out for subsequent webinars and the questions that you've got. If we can't answer them now, then we'll set up a webinar in order to do that. So I hope that helps answer that question, Josh.
Great, Sean. Thank you very much. So just before we turn our attention to the audience questions, maybe one other one that kind of overlaps with some of the questions that have come through, kind of around integrity and kind of the financial aspects around that. There's a question here about what about financial integrity safeguards in the BioCredita program? Is that something that you would be able to speak to about, Sean?
Yeah, sure. Because there's no fixed price for biodiversity credits, because different projects will have different cost structures. So the price is going to be different for different projects. And if the prices are going to be different, then how can a buyer be confident that there's not something strange going on or untoward happening? And what we do in the BioCredita program is we require projects to develop a cost declaration. They need to essentially demonstrate their budget. And that budget needs to be independently verified by the verifier. In this case, it's McHugh and Shaw Limited, to make sure that it is an efficient budget. It's not hiding some sort of super profit in there, and that it is the true cost of delivering that biodiversity conservation in that project. And so that's one way that we have an integrity safeguard. Another integrity safeguard that we've built is to have an option for market intermediaries, in other words, say traders or retailers, who would buy biodiversity credits at one price and then on-sell them at another, because that's essentially what trading is all about. The price that they sell them at has to cover their costs of providing that intermediary service. So think about a retailer, like a retail shop. They've got overheads. They need to charge a higher price for the goods that they sell than the price that they pay for them in order to fund that service. So we've got an option for market intermediaries to get an ethical trading certificate from our program, where they show that their margin is an appropriate margin rather than sneaking a super profit in there and running away with, essentially exploiting people's compassionate regard for nature. So those are two examples of how we build financial integrity into the program. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, it's time to pivot to the audience questions then, and thank you for upvoting as well, so we can keep this, as I said, nice and democratic. Right on top of the list is a question from Adam, and this kind of harks back to what you initially referred to before, Sean, around kind of the conditions for a project being eligible. So this is around additionality. So Adam's asking, additional, does this mean that these credits for these credits, that this work wouldn't happen without the credits as such? I'm wondering whether you can lift the veil a little bit about the term additionality, because I think some people in the audience are not quite familiar with that, and just in terms of the safeguards of work happening where it's most needed.
Okay, no, very good point. And additionality is fundamental to this whole market, because if they're not additional, then it would have happened anyway. And then the money that people spend is essentially a waste of money. They might as well have spent it on something else. So additionality is key. If anyone wants to look at the detailed additionality requirements of projects that use this program, then go to our website, go to the Biodiversity Credits page, and then on that page you'll see the standard, our standard, against which projects are verified to. And then you can scroll in the standard and look at the additionality requirements. The key thing about additionality for this instrument is essentially financial additionality. Okay, so that means that, for example, Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari needs to raise a non-trivial sum of money every year in order to continue to manage the mountain and all the biodiversity benefits it's delivering. If that amount of money that it receives goes down, then it won't be able to deliver those services, okay? Because the services will degrade because they're not being done because they can't be funded. So Sanctuary Mountain has to show an auditor that that funding is needed and that it can't get it from grant funding or by the funding it's already receiving, which is why it's pivoting into a market-based mechanism. And that's exactly what's happened to Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari. And in fact, I'll invite Helen to share a little bit about her experience in how crucial it is to find another funding source. But before I do, that financial additionality is key. So if you're starting up a new project, the biodiversity benefits aren't possible without the project, and the project isn't possible without the finance that comes from the sale of these biodiversity credits, certainly at that scale. So that's essentially what this additionality needs, and projects need to demonstrate that, not to Ekos, but to an independent third-party auditor. But just to sort of drive home that point, Helen, financial additionality at the mountain.
Yeah, so if I use last year as an example, when I arrived into the trust, we have been operating at a loss month on month, and that, excuse me, some months that's 30 grand a month, some months that's more. Overall, last year, including depreciation, we would have posted over $500,000 operating loss. And if I take out of it the tourism side of the business, which essentially is one of our funders, so we run our tourism business, we would have been short funding of around $774,000 for the last fiscal year. And look, I do appreciate for some of you sitting in this call, like you, I've worked in organisations where that kind of money is small, tiny amounts of money that you wouldn't even flick an eyelid at. But when you come here, it's that is a huge amount of money. I mentioned before, we cost around $5,000 a day to keep the sanctuary running, which again, in most organisations is not very much money, but we've had to just keep the lights on. I've seen in the last, since I've arrived, a team of 14 rangers go down to currently 5. That's significant. It means that we are trying to do all the same work with significantly less resource. So that's how we bridge the gap, and our goal is to not have to bridge the gap. Is that actually where we don't just deliver the minimum of the work programs we need, we're delivering well above and beyond the work programs that we have, extending the sanctuary walls out to the surrounding areas, delivering aspirations of a wild and kiwi population, all of those sorts of things. So lots to do, but that explains to you some of the challenges and why we need different tools in our toolkit, and this is a really critical one for us.
Thanks, Helen. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Helen. Thanks for kind of contextualizing that concept of additionality as well, because without context, sometimes it's kind of hard for people to kind of identify what that actually means. So we'll move on again. So there's a question from Cam Walker, also a very popular one. Just kind of a technical question. You mentioned before, Sean, that credit is priced at cost. Does this reflect the cost of actual on-the-ground biodiversity work, or also any transaction costs? I'm wondering whether you could unpack that a little bit as well, what that means.
Very good question. So the true cost of getting a sack or getting organic potatoes to somebody who wants to buy them from a supermarket includes the cost of producing them on the ground, and includes the cost of getting them to the market. It includes the cost of the overheads associated with the retailer, it's costs associated with quality control and quality assurance. So the true cost of your potatoes, which you buy, cover all of those costs. And that's really what a retail price is about, to cover that true cost. So biodiversity credits include the capital expenditure costs of the project. So that might be the cost to establish an ecosystem if there wasn't already one there. Imagine you're going to, I don't know, plant up a forest or plant a waterway or establish a wetland by doing some engineering. So that's that capital cost. There's the ongoing operating costs. There also might be opportunity costs, because if somebody is, let's say you've got a farmer who's making a living off some boggy farmland, which would be better if it was farming eels instead of cows. And the farmer says, well, look, I'd love to farm eels or even just farm biodiversity, but I need the income from my cows in order to just pay the bills and keep, the wolf from the door. Then that's an opportunity cost. And so that's a legitimate cost in a biodiversity conservation program. And in fact, the inability of grant funding to be able to cover opportunity costs has been a great barrier to achieving a lot more biodiversity conservation on private land, because farmers are often asked to fund biodiversity conservation out of their own pockets on their own land when they need that land in order to make a living for their families. So when you can include the opportunity cost, then farmers can be paid an equivalent to farming what they would be ordinarily farming to farm biodiversity. And if the market is willing to pay that price, because it knows that it's the true cost of doing biodiversity conservation on private land, then we'll get a lot more of it happening. The other cost includes the overheads, the transaction costs, the cost of measurement, reporting and verification, the costs of distribution, and also the cost of capital. So if you're borrowing money in order to establish the project, well, imagine you take out essentially a mortgage, and maybe it's a 10-year mortgage, and you raise $1 million and you're going to pay it back over 10 years' time, over a period of 10 years. Well, that annual debt servicing is essentially an operating cost, and so that can be included in the unit price. And what this does is it allows conservation to target commercial financing for the establishment of a project. So go to banks, to go to private investors, to raise the capital to establish the project, and then use biodiversity credit sales to essentially cover the cost of debt servicing along with those other costs. And so this is why the cost declaration is a bit complex. It's got to cover all of these different line items and justify those line items so that nobody is in there taking money that isn't justifiable, so that the farmer isn't claiming to have an opportunity cost when they didn't. Like, imagine it's land that they're not using for production already, and maybe they can't justify any kind of payment. So that's where the financial integrity safeguards come in, and they focus very closely on getting a fair unit price.
All right. Thanks, Sean. I'm just going to move on to another question. I'm just wondering whether we've kind of, in some ways, you've spoken about this already. It's about how much demand there might be for purchasing these credits. I think we've talked about organizations that have already engaged with us. I suppose we can use perhaps this as a proxy. We've got, like I said, almost 200 people earlier on in this meeting as well. So that could be, of course, supply and demand as such. But I think there's a healthy demand out there for that. So I might just leapfrog and we'll go on to Belinda's from Toitu, and really around kind of the kind of inspiration for the setup of this program. She's asking, really interested to see your work in this area. Did the design of the program cover the elements considered in Manaki Whenua in the recent policy brief? I'm not quite sure if you're able to speak to this at all in terms of that policy brief and whether that's something that has informed the setup of of our program, Sean.
Thanks for the question, Belinda, and thanks for coming along. So we started building this years ago, and we've been pioneering work in this space for quite some time. We sold biodiversity credits the first time in 2014, and then we've built on that kind of experience and then did some international work, for example, for the African Development Bank to develop a non-carbon unit-based financing mechanism for climate change adaptation called the Adaptation Benefit Mechanism. And then it was from that experience and also our experience in the carbon markets and our concern and care for biodiversity to want to pivot into the biodiversity market space. So we've been at this for a long time. So the short answer is I'm happy to check their policy brief and see whether it aligns. But certainly what MFE have been doing is learning from us, because we're like a pioneer out on a field playing this new game called biodiversity markets, and we're like in the scrum, and we know what it feels like in the scrum, but spectators don't. And so policymakers tend to be spectators in this space, and it's valuable if they can learn from early movers like ourselves, like Ekos and Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari. And so that's essentially where we're at. We've been ahead of the game. Happy to look at that policy brief and see the extent to which we align. But at the same time, our work is helping to inform government in a lengthy conversation that we've been having to help government understand what it's like at the coalface, because some non-market actors might think that certain rules and things need to be put in place, and people like us can help them understand whether or not they're actually going to work in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for kind of highlighting the fact that this is something that hasn't just come overnight. It's something that's we've been put a lot of hard mahi in over quite some time, and there's been a bit of a lead up as well. But really valid question, of course. I just wondered whether we can kind of expand our scale a little bit. There's a question. Once again, I'm going to do a little leapfrog, and this is a question from Diana Rossiter around kind of international possibilities. So it says here, have you sought to engage international interest in BioCredita? New Zealand is recognised as a biodiversity hotspot, of course, and has one of the least corrupt democracies in the world. These taken together should elevate New Zealand biodiversity credits on the international markets. I'm wondering whether, getting towards the end of our webinar, that might be something to kind of broach as something kind of worthwhile considering.
Sure. The short answer is watch this space. So absolutely. Like, we don't expect the New Zealand domestic market to be big enough to cover all of the demand for biodiversity conservation financing in this country. We are a biodiversity hotspot globally. We are one of the least, I think we're the second or third from the top of the least corrupt countries. So we're a handy place to invest and a handy place to do business with. And we want to trade on that. We want to take advantage of that. And we want to export these biodiversity credits to Europe and North America and Singapore and Australia and elsewhere. And we're in the process of setting that up. And one of the ways to be eligible to sell on things like international trading platforms is to have a really robust standard registry, quality control and quality assurance, third-party verification, all of these things. And what that does is it opens up that possibility for that international storyline. And maybe, Helen, you could reflect on that too, because wouldn't that be exciting to export biodiversity credits and get foreign exchange for looking after your maunga?
Yeah, look, and ultimately, what are we looking for? I mean, a large reason that we've partnered with Ekos is all the things that Sean's just described, and it's about us being bold and innovative and being able to go out beyond the waters of New Zealand and seek investment internationally. I would love to be in a place where there was enough private investment nationally to feed all of the conservation projects around the country, but the reality is they're just simply not. So for us to go international makes perfect sense. It's a case of finding the right partner and making that happen. We feel at Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari that we've absolutely found the right partner in Ekos, and it's the quality of the work that Sean and his team have put together that gives us absolute confidence to launch this today. And then hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll have some more news for you around the international space.
Fantastic. That's exciting, Helen and Sean. We're getting pretty close to the wrap up, so I'm going to see if I can sneak in one quick question, very popular, merging Sarah and Christopher's question. It's a bit of a hard one. How would we measure biodiversity? And what happens if biodiversity decreases from one year to the next? And then adding on to Christopher's creative ideas, that could be a bushfire, flood, storm. How could that affect the projects as such? And what are the measures in place to deal with that? I know it's a bit of a hard
Very,
one to answer.
very good question. So the grant funders face the same problem. Like, they're giving money to cause good. They don't require Helen to give them an absolute guarantee that a cyclone's not going to come and smash over some trees and break the fence. That's not their condition upon giving funding. So it's important to not be unrealistic about the expectations to be imposed upon biodiversity conservation efforts. The question also included, well, what about, proving the biodiversity beneficial change, right? The biodiversity uplift or downscaling. In our program, there's two options for your methodology for issuing credits. Option one is to measure the beneficial change in the ecosystem and then issue biodiversity credits on that basis. So then you have to do high resolution measurement and prove that year on year, your intervention has caused exactly and only that change in that ecosystem. And then, of course, you'd have problems if natural circumstances were meaning that whether you had the project or not, there was going to be a drought and maybe a disease outbreak in a certain species. So there are many things that you can't control in biodiversity conservation, but what you can control is your effort to look after the place, right? So the second option for the BioCredita program is to do what we call a verified cause approach, where you do conservation management and you do everything you can to reduce risk. And somebody who wants to cause that conservation management can cause it by buying these biodiversity credits, right? And that's how grant funding and philanthropy has worked down through the ages. And what's good for grant funding is also good for us. And it's also quite simple. It means that we're not trying to explain to a buyer some sort of nuanced biodiversity metric and why this metric is valuable and able to be issued as credits, but another biodiversity metric isn't. It's really simple. It's saying this conservation management effort needs money to happen. Do you want to provide that money? And if you do, buy these credits. And then that effort happens, right? So of course that effort has happened in the past because we issue credits on an annual basis on prior vintages. But that conservation management effort has to keep continuing year on year on year. And that's the basis upon which I think most projects in our biodiversity credits program will probably operate. And therefore, it's just an extension of philanthropy. It's not that different. Helen?
I was going to say, just before we reach time, just quickly, I think the other thing to note is that if a natural disaster did occur at the Maunga, our work programs only intensify, they don't reduce. So, if we have a cyclone come through the fence, I can assure you my team are not sitting back going, oh, well, there's no point. We're straight in there going and doing the mahi. So for me, I look at it and go, the costs are still there. And the recovery would still be there. So we would still be contributing from a biodiversity element. It's just actually everything becomes more intense for us and a little bit gnarlier out there. So yeah, back to you, Josh.
Great, thanks very much. I think we've tried to squeeze in as much as possible, and it's been extremely rich in terms of conversation and insight. So thank you so much. Yes, we haven't been able to get to all 60 remaining questions left. We will endeavor to do so, of course, in future webinars, and feel free, of course, to get a hold of us at Ekos as well if you've got direct questions. So thank you, Sean and Helen, for sharing your insights. Thank you, everyone who's joined us here today. We hope you feel inspired with what you've heard, and to learn more to get involved, please, as I said before, visit the Ekos website, look for the homepage link to the biodiversity credits to learn more about BioCredita and to support projects like Sanctuary Mountain Maungatautari. So we look forward to seeing you all at future webinars if you're able to make it. Have a great day, everyone. Mā te wā.